The kids' sermon's more fun than the main sermon sometimes. I love being with the kids. It's a lot of fun. Well, today, sorry for those of you who are here for the first time or haven't been in a while. We just started last week a new series of sermons, kind of looking into some of what our church is all about. We're part of the Presbyterian family, and that Presbyterian is a big word for elders. So we're a church that has elders. If anybody in here is an elder right now or ever was an elder before, raise your hand, just so you can see. Okay, so those are some of the elders, either right now of this church or of other churches of the Presbyterian family, and they're people who are kind of the leaders, they're kind of the bosses. So I stand up here every Sunday, but I'm not the boss of this place. The elders are the boss. They're my boss. I work for them. And they're nice people, so it's okay, right? Works out. So we're looking at a little bit of what this Presbyterian church is all about. Whoops, I pressed the wrong button. Sorry about that. Let's get back in here. Uh-oh. My bad. I went all the way back to the beginning. Give me a second. Okay, here we go. So we've been talking about this movement of Christianity that started back about 500 years ago at the time of the Reformation. Back in the fall, we talked a little bit about this, Martin Luther and this kind of Reformation, trying to fix some of the problems that were going on in the Catholic Church at that time, and it resulted in a bunch of new churches. It resulted in our Presbyterian churches, or other churches are called Reformed. It resulted in Lutheran churches, like Grace Alone right down the street, that's one of our partners. It resulted in Anglican churches and Episcopalian churches, as they're sometimes called, which are, there's another one down on Riverland Road that we work with, as well as Baptists and a lot of other denominations kind of come out from that time. But right now we're focusing on this thing called TULIP, and these are kind of, as we've said, they're kind of the distinctives of the Reformation. They're kind of the key points for us as Reformed Christians, as Presbyterian Christians. They're kind of what sets us apart in a way from some other Christians. And by the way, you know, some people may be worried a little bit once you get into these things, and it's maybe stuff you're not too familiar with. It's okay, you can still be a Presbyterian even if you're not like 100% convinced about these things. I think of it kind of like, you know, the Pirates of the Caribbean. You remember the original movie where they had the code of the pirates, and somebody said they're really more like guidelines, you know. They're just kind of guidelines. And so that's what these are. They're kind of guidelines of the Presbyterian family. And here they are again for those who weren't here last week or don't remember them already. TULIP stands for Total Depravity, Unconditional Election, Limited Atonement, Irresistible Grace, Perseverance of the Saints. Those are the 5 kind of distinctives of the Reformed tradition. Last week we covered the kind of downer, which is total depravity, that we're all messed up, basically, which is not really news. If you watch the news, you kind of get that pretty much every day from the news, right? We're in a messed up world, a bunch of messed up people in a messed up world, and that's why we need a Savior. That's why we need God in our lives. And so now we're moving on to the next one, unconditional election. Not really, you know, an election like we think of it, like it looks like in this picture, but unconditional election. Now these, as I said last week, these phrases can be really hard to figure out, and that's why one of the challenges of preaching something like this is trying to figure out how to explain it. And so I'm going to try. Hopefully this will make some sense in a way. But I want to tell you, because as I was thinking about how do you talk about this thing of unconditional election? Well, it had me thinking about an experience that we had a number of years ago. My family and I had. We were flying from South Korea, where we lived. We had come to Jacksonville, Florida, which is where my family lives, and we were returning back again to Korea, and that was our plan anyway. I had a ticket that I had purchased online on a particular airline that I had vowed never to travel on again as long as I live. I won't say which airline it is, but it's the national airline of a country to the north of the United States, populated by people who like maple syrup and are really good at hockey. Joan's not here, so I can get away with this. But anyway, their airline. Anyway, and so what happened was, I had this ticket. We got to the airport early in the morning, very early in the morning. We'd gotten up at like 4 o'clock in the morning to make sure to get to the airport on time because we had an early morning flight. My parents were there to say goodbye to us and everything. We checked our bags, and we got up to the counter to get our tickets printed out. And the lady at the counter said, well, sir, yes, you can't get on this flight. And I'm just like, excuse me? I'm holding an itinerary here that says I'm on this flight. And so she looked me in the eye and she said to me with a completely straight face, she said, well, yes, sir, I can see that you do have tickets, but you don't have seats. And so at this time, having woken up at about 4 o'clock in the morning to get to the airport on time, a little bit of my pastoral Christian patience was kind of wearing thin, and I asked, a rough translation would be, how on earth is such a thing possible? And she said, talk to your travel agent about it. I don't have a travel agent because I purchased these tickets online. So, long story short, we had to spend about an hour in the airport on the phone with representatives of that airline. And at one point, they even asked me, okay, sir, can you take your phone to the lady at the counter so I can tell her what to do in the computer? And so I actually had to give this lady my phone and let her own company people tell her what to do in the computer. It was crazy. But it had never occurred to me that I could have a ticket that I paid for and yet not have a seat on the airplane. That just made absolutely no sense to me whatsoever. I discovered later some other friends of mine had the same problem with the same airline during the same period in other parts of the United States, so I decided never to fly them again. But this unfortunate experience can maybe help us think a little bit about unconditional election, the U in that word TULIP that we were talking about. When I got to the airport that day, I did not know that my ability to get on the airplane had a condition attached to it. Not only did I have to have tickets, which I already had, but I also needed to have a seat confirmed for me and every member of my family. And so I met the condition to get a ticket on the plane, but somehow I didn't meet the condition to have a seat, and therefore I was not allowed to get on the plane. For Presbyterians, this is what we're talking about in a way with unconditional election. What we're saying is God's grace, okay? The grace God freely chooses to bestow on us has no conditions placed on it. There are no limitations to it. The focus in unconditional election is on God's sovereignty or God's lordship, as it is in all of the Presbyterian or Reformed tradition. Our focus is on God, God's freedom to decide what happens in the world, God's purposes, God's agenda, not our own. And that's where we are distinct from a lot of other churches. Some other churches and a lot of other churches, people focus a lot on us, on my feelings and my will to accept whatever God is offering or not. And part of that, I think, comes from our kind of marketplace mentality in this world that we live in. It's always, I can pick or choose whatever I want. I can go to whatever church I want to go to. I can buy whatever kind of car I want to go to. If I don't like this pastor, I'm going to another church where I like the pastor better. Or if this church doesn't have the kind of kids program I want, then I'm going someplace else, right? That's the culture that we live in. That's our kind of consumer mentality, pick and choose. But for us, it's not really about us. It's about God. It's about God's freedom. It's about what God has done in Jesus Christ. That's where we put the focus. And it's interesting that we were talking a little bit about these different church traditions, and I was kind of confused. I always thought, well, the difference is between us saying that God has already chosen and these other guys, the Armenians, saying that we have free will. But I found out that's not really the case. Both sides believed in God's choice. The question was this: does God choose people already knowing in advance whether they're going to work out, whether they're going to be good? It's kind of like a business thing if you think about it. Is God making a wise investment? Is he choosing a stock? People like us, knowing that we're going to pay him back, that he's going to get dividends, he's going to get results out of us, right? And the other kind of branch of Christianity, the Armenians, said, yes, God can see in advance if we're going to have faith, if we're going to believe in him, if we're going to be worth his time or not. But John Calvin, starting with John Calvin, with Luther, with some of the other early reformers, they said, that can't be right. That's kind of tying God's hands. God has the freedom to choose according to his purposes, whether we turn out to be good people or not, whether we look like the best kind of people in the world or not. We focus in a couple of scriptures. There's a lot of scriptures. We don't really have time to go into them today. But a couple of key scriptures, like we read this morning, that bring us in this direction. One of them is Jeremiah chapter 1, right? As we read this morning. Jeremiah, a lot of the prophets, we think about these holy people in the Bible as people who always said yes to God. Haven't you heard sermons like that? These are people who said yes to God. But actually, if you read the Bible carefully, almost all of them said no. Multiple times, right? Right? If you read your Bible, Moses said, here I am, God, send Aaron. Send my brother, because I can't talk. Right? I stutter. Send somebody else. He was scared. Right? And when we come to Jeremiah, the same thing. Jeremiah said, oh, God, I'd love to go, but you know what? I'm too little. I'm just too young. I'm a kid. You need to find somebody who's more professional, who knows more about this prophet thing. But God had a really amazing answer, He could have said, shut up, I'm God. You got to do it. But he said something really amazing. He said, before you were formed in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. Right? I already had a plan for you. There's nothing you can tell me right now that's going to surprise me because I know everything about you. No arguing with that, right? Jeremiah had been chosen even before he had been born. It was God's choice, not his own. Another key text was from Ephesians chapter 1. That's another one that we read this morning. Paul, the famous apostle, was speaking to the church, the Christians at Ephesus, and he takes things even further back. God said to Jeremiah, before you were born, before you were formed in the womb. But Paul takes us all the way back to the beginning. Paul says, God chose us before the foundation of the world. Right? God predestined just means he chose us in advance, right? He chose us to be adopted as his children through Jesus Christ, according to God's will and purposes. Paul was confident that the people he was speaking to had been chosen by God to be there. It wasn't an accident. They were chosen. They were selected, elected, right, to be there, even before the world was created. And so this other idea we talked about, conditional election, right? That's kind of the opposite. It means God puts conditions. And I think it's a lot like what I was thinking is it's a lot like that problem I had with that airline that needs to remain kind of anonymous, except I kind of told you who they were. But it's kind of like that problem that we had with that airline. There was a condition. I had a ticket, but I didn't have a seat, so I couldn't get on the plane. Right? And we have a problem with that, putting conditions on God's freedom. Their tradition says God's choice is conditioned by our response and future actions, by whether or not we're a good investment for God, basically. But here's the problem, because we think this is all about grace. And if you think about it, if it's about me, if it's about my choice, if it's about my future actions, then it's about me, right? How good of a guy I am, or how good of a guy I'm going to be, right? But if it's grace, then it's all about God. And if grace is something that we think we deserve, then it's really not grace. It's kind of payment, isn't it? Right? If I invest wisely in business, I expect to be repaid, right? But grace is different. Right? Grace is God's love poured out upon people like us who don't even deserve it. And because this is great news for me, because if I'm being honest, if I put myself in the place of God for just a minute, if I imagine God looking at my heart, seeing what a mess I am inside, I would just say, you know what? That one's a little too much of a fixer-upper for me. I'm going to go with somebody else. I'm not going to invest in that one. He's not worth my time. He's not worth my energy, right? Let me go invest my grace someplace else. But I thank God that that's not the way God works. The Bible tells us while we were still sinners, while we were still a mess, right? While our lives were a total train wreck, God sent Jesus Christ for each one of us. No conditions. You get a ticket and you get a seat on the plane, right? Signed, sealed, and delivered. No going back. Well, today we have communion. We have this experience of the Lord's table. And this table is here because of God's unconditional grace. You know, we see those pictures of the Last Supper of Jesus sitting at the table with the disciples, and we think, man, isn't it great? All those great guys sitting around the table together, worshiping with Jesus, sharing with him, right? Such wonderful people. But just think a little bit deeper. Think about those guys, right? The people who would betray him to death. Judas was there, right? Sitting at the table. People who would deny, they would swear on their mother's grave that they never knew him. Peter, sitting there at the table. Right? People who would run away like cowards and leave him to face judgment. Everybody else was sitting at the table. And Jesus said to those people, this is my body. This is my blood given for you. Let's pray. Gracious God, we are humbled by your grace. The grace of a God who loves us even when we don't deserve it. Maybe even because we don't deserve it. Prepare us, Lord, prepare our hearts and our minds to come to this table to share in your presence and to take that grace with us into the world. In Jesus' name we pray.